Hello, Talking Reef. This is Astrivian on the forums, or the real name being Samuel. You may remember me and this little project of using aquariums as simulations for education from a past episode of Talking Reef. This is a presentation that I gave to NASAGA, the North American Simulation and Gaming Association. It was originally a slideshow that was done in Keynote, and I exported it here to a movie. And I'm just going to kind of narrate what my notes were during it. Just as a note, a lot of this stuff is more relevant for those who are interested in education to some degree. I'm not going to really say anything about, how to maintain your tank. So with that, let's go ahead and get started on the presentation here. The title of this, Punk Rock Fish, was actually the name given to the long-nosed hawkfish up here by one of the students. I did not realize that plaid was a punk rock kind of thing. I thought it was more of a Midwest farmer thing, but whatever. So first of all, in case you haven't seen or listened to the last episode I did with Rob, the study that we did here was with 5 participants, high school students, all of them. They were all actually it was summer school. They were just about to graduate from high school. It lasted 2 weeks, which isn't that long in terms of setting up an aquarium, but it was all the time we had. They set up one aquarium each, which was a very expensive way of doing this. And what we did was we used this framework when we applied the aquarium in the classroom. And a lot of this framework may look very familiar to you if you've ever used a game or simulation such as Oregon Trail or whatever in a classroom before. Basically, all you do is you start with some sort of briefing. The teacher tells you, what's going on. This is what you're going to do. This is how you're going to do it. So, in our case, we introduce the students. Okay, this is what you're going to set up an aquarium in this class. This is why. This is how you're going to set it up using what tools, what methods, whatnot. And then later on, you move into the actual simulation, which was in our case actually putting together the aquarium and having the students add their fish and no corals, but fish and some inverts, and then the debriefing, which is where you sit everyone down and kind of talk to them about what they did, how they did it, why they did it, and then finally assessment, some sort of assessment of learning to some degree. We used just a verbal assessment, a very informal way of doing it. So this was the definition of microworld that we used to put together the simulation and to guide how we used it in the classroom. The definition reads, a microworld is an isomorphic representation of a reference system where elements of the reference system are reduced, abstracted, and or symbolized in a play space to allow for situated, immersive, and facilitated learning by a player or players. And I realize that is quite a cumbersome definition. So let me kind of go through some various pieces of it real quick so you can kind of see how we used the aquarium and how that fits into all this. The first word, isomorphic, is more complex than it needs to be, I guess. All it means is similar but not exact, and that comes from an article Peters down there. So a UNC satellite photo is similar to but not exact. It's not the exact same thing as a topographical map. That's all that it means. So an aquarium, a marine aquarium, is similar to an ocean, but it is not an exact representation of it. The next part is reference system, and all that means is what the microworld refers to. What system does it represent in some way, shape, or form? What is the reference system of an aquarium? Well, the ocean, of course. So the next part of the definition is just that the reference system is reduced, abstracted, or symbolized into the play space. Or let's take for our example of an aquarium. Our reference system is the ocean, and that's too big. We can't fit that in an aquarium, so we have to reduce it. We take 1 times 10 to the 21st power liters of water and reduce it to 113.5 liters, or about 30 gallons. That's a pretty serious reduction. But that's all that reduction means. We're simplifying the entire reference system. The next part of it is abstraction, and that's just changing the appearance of various elements within it. So if we take the shape of the Caribbean, we're going to abstract that into a rectangle. Kind of boring, but it serves the same function. we can recreate a simulation of the Caribbean Sea pretty well with a rectangular shape, or looking at an aquarium from the top down. Symbolization is the last one, and all that refers to is using a new element in the simulation to represent something that was happening in the reference system. So in our case, a protein skimmer is a symbolization of the crashing of the waves and how that mixes the air with the water. So next is a list of the reference systems that we gave to the students: freshwater, African rift lakes, Asian freshwater, brackish, Amazonian, South American freshwater systems, Indo-Pacific, cold water, and Caribbean. Most of the students chose Indo-Pacific. We had one student choose Caribbean and one student choose Asian freshwater sharks. The play space is in many ways a simulation itself. This includes everything, not the medium, not how it's delivered, but in our case it would include all the research that we did. It includes the sheets that we handed them, the coral they had, the water, the sand, the fish, the lighting, the filtration, the heaters, what else? The hydrometer, the testing kits, all that is part of the play space. It's all the items that they had to work with while they were building their tank. The first part, the briefing, consists of mostly these two pieces. What I call meta world and meta knowledge. Meta world is everything that the students know about the simulation, or say aquariums, before you even start. So this would include anything they've read, any kind of advertisements, any trips to the fish store, any kind of internet research, book reading, anything. Meta knowledge is anything they need to know in order to set up an aquarium, and anything they need to know to play the game or the simulation. Now, for our case, what we used for meta knowledge was we had them test all these different water samples from around the area. They put together the full food web of the ecosystem they chose, the reference system. We went to the Denver Aquarium. Of course, we listened to a bunch of Talkingreef podcasts, and we did a few little lecture styles and whatnot. All this was to teach them about the food web, pH, alkalinity, all the nitrogen cycle, a little bit about carbon cycle, some about lighting, husbandry, how to mix water, and all this other kind of fun stuff. Now, when we moved into facilitated play, that was the second phase here. After they learned everything they needed to know, they learned the limits of the aquarium and what they could do with it as opposed to the ocean and whatnot, and how to manage everything. And then they used all these various tools that we gave them: the aquariums themselves, the various kinds of gravel or crushed coral or whatever they were using, live rock, wood, and of course the fishies. And they used all this to assemble the aquariums in the way that they wanted, hopefully trying to mimic as best as possible the natural ecosystem that the fish would find. So if you're using crushed coral, dead coral, they have to set it up so that it actually looks like a reef, not just a pile of coral at the bottom of the tank. Or especially in the freshwater case, for example, when you need to set it up in such a way that it would look like the Asian ecosystem would. The third phase is the debriefing phase. Now, I have to emphasize this to anyone who's going to use aquariums as educational tools. The debriefing phase is critical, absolutely critical. It is not an option. No matter how much time you spend on the briefing, or what type of assessment you use, or what type of aquarium you use, whether you have each person do it like we did, or you have one big one, or whatever, debriefing is absolutely essential. Again, it's not optional. If you want students to learn from it, you have to do this. And basically, you have to step out of the play space. You have to get them away from their aquarium and talk about it. And there are certain structures from the research and whatnot of how this conversation should take place. There's also two basic parts to it. The first part is usually a conversational debriefing, which is really just sitting around talking to each other. And the second part moves into more of a written debriefing, and this is what you can use for assessment later. The first part of this, stage one, is just description, and it's immediately after you're finished with the facilitated play part. So right after they're done setting up their aquariums or whatever. For us, it was immediately after they were finished setting up their rock, and this is actually as we were acclimating the fish. We decided to do this part. So All I asked them was, okay, what did you do? What are you doing? What ecosystem did you choose? How are you setting up your tank, and why are you setting it up that way? The idea of this first phase is just so they recall everything that was going on and they can hear what other people were doing. I'm assuming this is a group work, not just a group debriefing, not just an individual person at a time. You sit them all around in a circle and talk about it. So what did you do? How did you do it? Why did you do it that way? And then you move into the second part. Now, the second part, after you get them to describe everything, you have them actually explain why they did certain things and analyze the behavior of others and of themselves. So you could say, well, let's say, one of the students did the Caribbean ecosystem and has all Indo-Pacific fish in there, Indo-Pacific fish and corals or whatever. And then you say, well, why did you do it that way? Was that a good idea? Did that really follow what you were supposed to be doing to begin with? Or, if you did do it that way, why is it? And then they might say, well, let's say they're setting up a full reef tank. So they say they have all Caribbean fish, but a lot of Indo-Pacific corals. And they say, well, there aren't that many corals from the Caribbean that you're allowed to have in a tank. Most of them are protected or something like that. So if that's the explanation, then that could work. But you won't know that unless you ask them. And this way, you have the students ask each other these questions as well. It's not just you asking the questions. If the conversation of the students veers in a certain direction, let it go. That is what we found, is just let them go where they want, and you end up with a really, really great assessment of how this works. Now, this last part here, application, is you have to bring what they learned from the aquarium back into the reference system as a whole. So we're saying, okay, you set up your marine tanks. Now let's apply that back to the ocean. And this was actually pretty successful. We showed them a couple examples of like open ocean aquaculture. We were talking to them about that, and they got they were fascinated by that. The idea of being able to raise tuna in these enormous nets out in the middle of the ocean. We also told them about various other things that go on in the ocean, such as fishing, wild caught fish, tank breeding fish, or aquaculturing fish, so you don't have to catch them from the wild anymore. Also, we did some what happens if you release exotic species into local ecosystems. We told them about the snakehead fish. They caught on to it pretty quick, and they started to see that the husbandry of their tanks applied very well to the general ecological practices in the wider oceans. Now, we actually couldn't do a written debriefing, so we had to move right into assessment. The students kind of rebelled on us. So we had to use what they told us to assess them. And there, as you can see, there are 5 basic steps that are recommended from all the references down there about how to assess from this. So using these steps, the first one, learning objectives, asks simply, were the objectives met? Did you do what you say you were going to do to begin with? In our case, we were using the food web, understanding the nitrogen cycle, and understanding the differences in those things between the various ecosystems. So using the verbal data that we gathered from the oral debriefing or the conversational debriefing, we determined, yes, we did pretty much meet the objectives. The next one is context, and that was how much time and space do we allow for the debriefing itself. Now, it's very similar to this next one, the type of debriefing used. So this is just simply asking, in our case, did we use a conversational or written debriefing or what? In our case, we only use conversational because the students refused to write. So fine. We had to go with the conversational one, but we had to keep that in mind when we were doing the assessment, that we don't have any actual written data. We don't have any multiple choice tests, short answer essays, or anything like that. So we have to adjust how we assess it. There's no quantitative assessing going on here. This is not to say you couldn't do it. Now, the next one, implementation, simply describes, did they have the materials? Could they fully immerse themselves in the play space? Now, this deserves some comment here because, as we found, we determined the answer is actually no. We actually had not a poor implementation, but we didn't have enough time. First of all, we only had 2 weeks. Honestly, if we wanted to do this again, I think it'd be better to do it for a whole semester or a whole school year. Then they really could get into all the various aspects of the aquariums and of their, all the life in it. They could add a lot more. Their tanks would mature all the way to pretty much the end, if you will. And they could go through the sand bed. They could explore stuff in there. They could see the algae growth. They could truly monitor the levels and watch the tank as it matures over time. They could also we don't think, in retrospect, I don't think we had enough money to really do it. If we had done one tank, I think this would have been a little bit easier, but we didn't have enough variety of live rock and dead coral and fish species and all this other stuff that they could use. We also didn't have very many different kinds of aquariums. They were all pretty much the same 35 gallon tanks. That's about all we had. We had smaller ones, but no one wanted those, of course. A couple students actually went out and bought their own aquariums, which we were fine with. Now, if we were to do, again, one tank, we'd probably just go buy one huge one, and that would eliminate a lot of that problem. See if we could find a lot of donated stuff and a lot of used equipment. But so in terms of the implementation, we thought actually that it could have been better. And this actually helps explain something. When we are actually looking at their tanks, they are far different than what they were saying they wanted to do. So for example, if you take a look at this one, this is the freshwater Asian with sharks aquarium that you can kind of see blurs of some of the sharks in here, but that he wanted to do. Now remember, he wanted to do a fully planted aquarium complete with a live bottom, all grass, grassy looking bottom, a tall, Amazon and swords and other various kinds of plants. And all that's in there right now is a piece of lava rock, which is that red stone, and a small piece of anacris. But his description sounded more like this picture. Now this is actually an image from the Vancouver Aquarium, one of their Amazon setups. Now this is more or less what he was describing, but if you can see the difference between these two images here, he was not able to set it up nearly as what he wanted to do. And that was actually indicated to us a lack of adequate resources. And so we couldn't really grade them based on the look of their tank alone. We had to really go by what they were saying in large part. So this last part, the learning process, this just asks, what kind of learning strategies do we use? And that really means, do we use lectures? Do we use video? Do we use podcasts? We used a whole huge variety of different stuff. Now that led to some interesting conclusions as well that we'll get to, and I'll get to in just a little bit here. But the first thing that we need to talk about is transfer. Now transfer is the application of knowledge gleaned from the play space or the microworld or the simulation to the reference system. So in other words, it's saying, okay, you set up your aquarium, you know how to set up your aquarium now, you learned a great deal about that. Does that mean you know anything about aquatic ecosystems? Can you transfer that knowledge from the aquarium and apply it in the actual reference system in the case of aquarium? And we actually found a couple different types of transfer, actually. We found the standard going from the play space to the reference system. We call that forward transfer, this one here, from the aquarium to the reef. But they also demonstrated what we kind of refer to as backwards. They would actually start from the reef and go and transfer back to their aquarium. So one such example of this was coral bleaching, actually. We had one student that was in Premier Fish and Reef during our tour, and we started up a discussion with the owner there about fluctuations in ocean temperatures, specifically in the Caribbean, and how that resulted to coral bleaching, such as in this chart. All the green dots are observed coral bleaching, 1997 to 2000. So we were talking about that, and he knew that fluctuations in ocean temperatures, such as this, resulted in the die-off of the coral, or them to expel the zooxanthellae. And then eventually die off. And so he transferred that back to his aquarium when he asked, well, is this heater going to hold my temperature constant in my aquarium, or will the temperature fluctuate so much that any coral that I wanted to, that he wanted to do later, put in there, would die? Well, it turns out that the heater did fluctuate. It fluctuated about 8 degrees Celsius, which he knew from the store was, and from that discussion, was way too much. So that was an example of transferring knowledge backwards from the reference system to the play space. So another type of transfer that we noticed that was much more rare than the forward and backward, what we called triple, and that was one of them starting from the play space, moving to the reference system, and then back to the play space. So they would start in their aquarium, they would notice something in there, say the growth of copepods or amphipods, check it out in the reference system or their ecosystem and see, oh yes, these are very common, and then go back to their aquarium and say, okay, how do we cultivate these? How do we get these to grow? That was the case for one of the students who wanted a Mandarin. The other one that was more common than that was reference system, play space, back to the reference system. So they would learn something about the reference system or the aquatic ecosystem. They would apply it in their aquarium, test it out, make some kind of observation there, and then go back to the reference system and check it and see if that was true as well. So now this part I wanted to talk about how the learning strategies that we use a little bit more. This is a graph or a chart of the various learning strategies that we use. So the top part, given, is play space, reference system, PS to RS, RS to PS, 3, and not given, NG. That is how we presented the knowledge to the students. So for example, if we just said something in the, you should keep your aquarium this way because it's going to help your aquarium, that's classified as just PS, just the play space. The knowledge was given only in the context of the play space. RS, reference system column, is, well, we told them something about the aquatic ecosystem, but didn't apply it to the aquarium at all. The other way is the play space to the reference system is just that. We said, the pH of your aquarium should be between, 8.3 or something like that. So, and that is what the pH is of the ocean in this area. In the Indo-Pacific, the pH is this. So we connected it to them directly to one of them. We started in the play space and moved to the reference system. The other column is the exact opposite. We talk about, say, take the coral bleaching one, for example. We said, okay, well, in aquatic ecosystems, the temperature range is this. Therefore, your temperature range in your aquarium should be the same thing if you're doing that ecosystem. So the not given is we didn't give it to them. That's something they researched on their own. Now you see the same information going down as the rows. So given, that's how we presented the information. Demonstrated is how they returned it back to us. So as you can see from this chart, let's take the first column, for example. So if you look at this first column, the highlighted one here, you can see that if we gave the information in the context of the play space only, in other words, we said you have to keep your aquarium this way because of this, because that's the way you're supposed to keep your aquarium. When they demonstrated this knowledge, they demonstrated it only in the context of their aquarium. They did not, in other words, transfer it to the aquatic ecosystem. Or they just plain didn't demonstrate it at all, down at the very bottom, ND, not demonstrated. There was one case where there was actually transferred. Most of the time, though, as you can see, it was a rare occurrence. If we gave information to them in the context of the aquarium only, and you don't make the deliberate connection to the aquatic ecosystem or the reference system in general, it will not be transferred, is what we concluded from that. So these next two columns are probably the two more interesting ones that we took away with. Basically, it didn't quite seem to matter whether we started from the play space and went to the reference system or started with the reference system and for the play space, although it does look better, reference system to play space. So basically what we concluded from this was the following. That there has to be a deliberate connection in the delivery of the knowledge. You have to connect the aquarium or the microworld to the reference system or aquatic ecosystem. So that connection has to be made for the students. It's not something that's not going to be a leap of faith on their part. You have to explicitly give it to them. And I'm not sure, we didn't have very many subjects, so statistically speaking, or quantitative statistically speaking, I don't think these numbers are significant. I didn't bother checking, but so to us, I honestly, I didn't think that it mattered so much which way you gave it. Whether you started, said, okay, in the aquarium, this works this way, this matters for the aquatic ecosystem because blah, blah, blah. Or if you start from the ecosystem, like the coral bleaching one, and say, okay, this applies to your aquarium because of such and such. So it didn't seem to matter so much for that. We didn't conclude, but that connection has to be made. As long as that connection's there, it will be returned in the same way. The demonstrated knowledge will be very similar. So now this next chart here shows how we gave, what teaching strategy we used to deliver whatever whatever meta-knowledge it was. So whether we modeled the behavior, we used just expository instruction in the case of, just lectures or talking and telling them. Researched is a lot of the research that they did on their own in a lot of lab time. And 2 or more, just combine 2 or more. As you can see from this, D is demonstrated, ND is not demonstrated. What I thought was interesting about this is modeled behavior was simply never returned to us. They never demonstrated that they understood that. What seemed to work best was expository or researched on their own. And what we took away from this, again, was that in combination with the last chart, it didn't matter so much how the knowledge was delivered to them, as long as the two were connected, as long as whatever you told them was connected to their game, in other words, to the simulation, to the aquarium, then it would be returned, regardless of how you gave it to them. Okay, so in conclusion, let's go back to our little model that we had originally. This didn't work. That was the major conclusion that we had. Instead, this is a better example. The cyclical processes between, especially the briefing and facilitated play, students would go back and forth and back and forth. Technically speaking, all the meta-knowledge they should have gained from us talking about it during the briefing, that's not what happened. They would go back and forth to the computer lab, to the aquarium, back to the computer lab. We think that allowed for that 3-way transfer that we saw earlier. That was a major contributor to it. And a linear process was way too restricting, so we just let them go. If they wanted to do more research, that was fine. Now, the thing that links the two is the premise, the reason they have for playing. So under the briefing, we have the meta-world, meta-knowledge, and suspension of disbelief. Under facilitated play, we just have immersive exploration, and that was a part that we kind of, lost a little bit. And then we did a very deliberate move over to the next cyclical part, which was debriefing and assessment, the 2 blobs there. Debriefing was going through back and forth between the 3 stages, and that again was back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We didn't restrict them in any way on that. We went from describing just what they did to analyzing what they did, back to describing and back, so the 3 steps also weren't linear. And the assessment, at least in our case, came out to be part of the debriefing itself. And we thought that they flowed very nicely together. And they would correct themselves, more of a collaborative effort of learning at that point. So now a future study, this is kind of what we hypothesized. First of all, is there something that connects the debriefing and assessment similar to premise? We didn't see much evidence of that. That's just more of a hunch and a desire for symmetry in the drawing, but than anything else. But the other thing that we were wondering is that other red arrow. Well, wait a minute. If these 2 sort of blobs, these egg-shaped things, are cyclical, if you can go from briefing to facilitated play over and over and debriefing to assessment over and over, can you go back and forth between these 2 major spots? I mean, is it bad if during the debriefing you send everyone back to the aquariums or to the simulation, to the microworld to mess around again? So that would be something that we would check out in the future and see if that would work, and what results from that. What kinds of information could we get from that? So again, thank you so much for putting up with this whole thing. I realize it was pushing almost a half hour here, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and have a good one.